Hello everyone, today we talk about Frederick II's policy, mostly from the late Innocent III's pontificate to 1229. Then we will look at the post-Crusade phase, where we talk about Frederick II, the Hohenstaufen. I even created a playlist about them, so for any further information you can check that. Today we look at this specific temporal spectrum about Frederick II's policy. So, you know what the deal was. Frederick had been posed since his minority, after he had remained orphan, first of his father, then of his mother, respectively Henry VI and Constance of Hauteville, under, in fact, the protection of the Pope. Right, for many reasons. We're talking about the pontificate of Innocent III. We also made a video about him recently. This was the acme of papal power. Frederick was not just the at that point the title holder of the kingdom of Sicily by inheritance, and so a papal vassal, as essentially the Siculo-Norman kingdom had inherited by the Hohenstaufen had been created back in the day probably as a papal fief and on papal behalf by the Normans, and so he had always this very close connection, also because it was next to Rome, and so very important. Sometimes had even posed a threat to the same papacy, and so the Curia wanted to ensure that Frederick would rise like a devout vassal. At the same time, he was essentially too this was more complicated than Innocent III initially played against, but he would have had to succeed to the imperial throne that, as you know, was dependent on the German election and eventually the papal crowning. And the greatest papal fear was, of course, the reconnection of the dynastic sum, let's say, of the Kingdom of Germany and imperial crown with the crowns of Italy and Sicily. That would have, if united under one single power, would have essentially brought the the papacy between two fires, right? That there is a broader international policy in this sense. Was done even with France and England when the French essentially launched the invasion of England at that point. Instead, the Pope prevented even the thing to unfold. To avoid would be another hyper powerful ruler would sum up the French and English crown at that point. And Innocent III was objectively also, of course, was not, however, an antagonistic figure. It was all a universalistic project that was the one of Christian unity, that the same Frederick eventually as Holy Roman Emperor. And this is the point. First, Innocent had backed, famously enough, Otto of Brunswick, who had, against very, very precise promise not to reunite Germany and Italy for no reason. Instead, the first thing, of course, Otto Brunswick did was to do that. We made several videos about that phase, this complex succession. We made videos about the Battle of Bouvines, about the election of the same Otto of Brunswick, also against Philip of Swabia, that was Frederick's uncle at that point. So a complex situation that, and I like to go, let's say, in different detail. I hope we will do it. We'll have the time to expand on these topics further, because they're very, as you know, very locally determined, and so the more you understand that, the more you understand the complexity of the world system. And eventually, what Otto of Brunswick, in fact, escaped papal control. Instead, the Pope backed Frederick's succession to the throne, because, of course, still, even though the German crown was elective, there was some dynastic principle informally given that the same Hohenstaufen and the Welfen house of Otto Brunswick were married into each other, were the most important families in the empire, and of course Frederick's father and grandfather had been Holy Roman emperors. They had, as Swabians, maintained that kind of power and authority. So it's obvious that Frederick here was summing still even something more with the Sicilian inheritance and more. And so for all what that meant for the Crusade, for example, as we'll see now, And as long as Innocent III was alive, Frederick was not allowed fundamentally to lead a too markedly personal policy. Right. On the contrary, Frederick was reproached to be excessively acquiescent to the policy of the great Pope, and in part, this was just a cold calculation, right? Frederick, since a very early age, had a very tough life, right? Just orphan, but also in this constant of, during his early, his youth in this situation of constant threat, right, of political instability. But Otto the Brunswick had invaded Sicily. He had been kidnapped by Markwald of Ambila. He was king of Sicily, but had a very small control at some point. The situation was very unstable, right? So, having the papacy supporting you in practice, because even back in Otto there was nothing properly against Frederick in his Sicilian prerogatives, but was having a great interest in the same papal policy and supporting that, and that's eventually was also a Holy Roman Emperor in theory should have done, and ideally, let's say, better later on. And he displayed, however, always a great sense of himself, of his status, of his background, of his intelligence too, because he was raised in a situation that also necessarily made him a quick learner of the world. In the streets of Palermo, in this incredibly threatening situation where he risked life more than once, considering all these political enemies, and so on. Things began to change also with age. People grow up in general, but also Innocent III's successor, the relatively meek Honorius III, 1216-1227, brought to an important change. In 1220, Frederick was first of all crowned Holy Roman Emperor, after having induced the German nobility to attribute the German crown to his son Henry, without, however, in fact, showing any intention to abdicate from the Kingdom of Sicily. This was important because essentially the Pope had asked equally, right, to anybody, at that point to any German ruler, never, at least, to abandon one of the titles. Of course, Frederick was not to give that up properly, right? He actually granted a sort of shared kingship, right, and some titles like the Duchy of Burgundy, rule on Alsace, and so on. Frederick cared very much about the role of German king, right, even though he was more distant from that world. But Frederick II's personality is dramatically interesting. He was an incredibly rational, determined, cold, right, scrupulous, but calculated, logical individual. And if you look at every political action he made, there is a very sound sense, right, of rule. And this, that things were incredibly difficult throughout all his reign, so we can't legitimately say that, he, in relative terms, he didn't have as many power as, his grandfather had, Frederick Barbarossa. But at the same time, if you look at what he was actually doing, he had, first of all, also he had kind of more, for a longer time, more responsibilities and, let's say, more, at least, first of all, simply a more developed system as Europe was becoming, to deal with, multiple crowns to care about. And in this sense, he would use different personas, right? Different faces, different masks, depending on whom he was dealing with, right? The Germans, the Lombards, the Pope, the Sicilians, the Saracens. It all depended, right? And so it's remarkable to see how this ruler was also his multicultural education was coming from, in terms of his great interest in science, and so that on Frederick II there haven't been essentially satisfactory biographies. Impossibly enough, the best ones are definitely the ones of Kantorowicz and Abulafia, but is one of those figures that the more you study, the more you still, right, every research on Frederick II brings up still something new, right, which we wouldn't think, but, more or less, a sovereign of the early 13th century. You would imagine, we know everything. Well, it's quite not the case, right? This picture of the sources and how Europe was turning to be at the time is extremely complex, extremely varied, and Frederick is also a character around which a myth was built, and partly was absolutely deserved, but in a sense, still, it's important to evaluate, to assess all his actions correctly, and it's really one of those sovereigns that if you check what they did concretely, that they had more than one reason to behave like that, and it's rare, right? For others, you just find essentially mistakes or excesses, logical or rational assessments, but maybe were inaccurate, right, incorrect. We were talking about it, Frederick Barbarossa the other day, saying yes, all good idea, but the ways it was enforced, was it successful? No, it wasn't successful, but probably there was something wrong there at some level. Frederick II was not successful either, but still it was a completely, or at least an importantly different behavior depending on the various circumstances, and accurately measured on the base of the contingency. Frederick had to, as you know, he had been raised in Sicily, so he, however, went to Germany at some point multiple times, and he tried, of course, to regain that point, those public, royal prerogatives that were owed to him, and he found, of course, a German situation in disarray, where properly the fundamentals of what the political institutional balance said, especially since his grandfather had basically evaporated in part exactly because of his minority during this interregnum, the civil strifes and so on. Also the same ecclesiastical princes veering away from the monarchy for creating their own lordships. So it was a very difficult situation where Frederick understood that he had to negotiate. He had fundamentally to negotiate on the public rights, and that he would sell later on, also with the edict in favor of the princes, to build at least to develop, to consolidate further a private asset possession, right? That he started mostly from Swabia, Franconia, where he wanted to expand also towards Austria, where the Babenberg succession was, presenting with very interesting opportunities to consolidate all the Alpine arc, and so securing the passages to Italy, the trade routes, and also just a lot of, very well, especially in Austria and under the Babenberg, a very compact and kind of modern and updated setting of, we can call a state, right? Administratively speaking, it was a very compact thing for feudal standards. And Frederick, in Germany, his favorite land was Alsace, because he realized also that was an area that had an important development, for which his favorite place was Agenau. But then he founded other towns, other mints, importantly enough. He understood the economical relevance of the region. It was also relatively more decentralized towards the west. And he could, more away from the German fix. And he took close to, part actually of Swabia in political, say, in district dependency. He, however, came back to Sicily at that point, and basically it was realized that he had not given up any of his crowns, really. He had just fundamentally entrusted his son, kind of greater prerogatives to rule in Germany. But the agreements with the Pope that had contemplated this renunciation to the various titles were actually not obeyed. And if you think about it, it wasn't even something that could just be asked. Of course, an agreement is an agreement, but what about the dynastic prerogatives and just the political reality, for that matter? And so Germany was in part left to his son's rule, albeit maintaining on it as emperor, because that was the point, the supreme authority. So it wouldn't change much in practice. So he didn't intend to abandon Sicily at all, for many reasons. Not just because people say, well, he was mostly, he was raised there, of course, he was culturally more Italo-Norman than German, undoubtedly, but the most consistent reason, of course, was that he knew very well the extraordinary economical possibilities of the kingdom, and he assessed fully the not less extraordinary geographical position of it for a universal policy in the Mediterranean. So, as we know also, Sicily during the Norman rule had been a bit like England, right? These were lands that had not known feudalism before. So when the Normans took them over, they could exploit essentially not just the pre-existing administrative systems that were normally more centralized than the one of Frankish, the Frankish ones that the Normans had brought. They still established feudalism, but in a much more, properly balanced way, with a much greater central power, and Sicily was at the top, right, in the entire Latin Germanic Europe in terms of centralization, even more than England, right? So the wars that had been fought there among the barons that had supported alternatively Otto of Brunswick, the Saint Frederick, and generally speaking also this German ministerialis that is settled there has lords since the time of Henry VI after his death, had remained there, in fact kind of blending in with the Siculo-Norman nobility, and in order to maintain their personal prestige, had naturally deteriorated even in there the central government and public authority. But under Frederick still the system was standing, right? So he worked relentlessly to reinforce the system, to restore the system, to strengthen it further. And he called two great assizes in the kingdom, one in Capua and one in Messina, respectively in 1220, 1221, when he ordered that all the royal rights that had been usurped previously by the vassals had to be immediately reintegrated. Importantly enough, he introduced the Roman law in Sicily. As you know, this had been pioneered mostly by the northern Italian cities, but this was, of course, what the Holy Roman Emperors had always essentially drawn from their juridical legitimization as fundamentally absolute rulers. That was an absolute novelty in the Latin Germanic world for how medieval law had fundamentally developed, and that could never, completely enforce nor consistently. But Frederick was the only ruler in this context that managed to integrate juridically the norm of essentially becoming source of law as a sovereign. However, albeit in the case of an absence, let's say, of a vacuum, let's say, in the legal system, so eventualities were not contemplated by the pre-existing right. That in fact he emanated in the Sicilian constitution, and that in the sense it's how far properly the absolute power of medieval rulers could go juridically wise, and of course this was all intertwined with the imperial, let's say, properly in the case this was properly just as a Sicilian king, right? But it's obvious that behind that was Frederick's sense of himself and the idea that a ruler here had a broader, universal, and divine connection, right? So that was the only possible authority on earth that could express such, such prerogative for oneself, for himself. Also, he founded the University of Naples in 1224, which was factually the first statal university in Europe, meaning that it was created expressly to nurture the administrative personnel of the kingdom, right? Properly, with a great emphasis on law. That, in fact, Frederick also imposed to be studied just in Naples, because most at the time, all the if you wanted to study law, you had to simply go studying in Bologna instead. Here, he obliged his own, the southern Italian intelligentsia to study just there, also, bringing this profit to the public institution. And in fact, thanks to this, he could dispose of a class of faithful and well-educated functionaries within the boundaries of his kingdom. And he, in this sense, he availed himself of them for as cameraries, as administrators all over the territory. He also importantly favored the studium, let's say, of Salerno. It was not really a university, but it was a medical school that historically had, prospered in the high Middle Ages, combining all the in the center Mediterranean, all this Christian, Islamic, Jewish knowledge in medicine, all the the great manuscript circulation from all over Europe, the Near East, and so on. So had become extremely famous and the top of medical teaching in Europe. So he reorganized thus the Kingdom of Sicily, eventually passing to the one of Italy, which was a bit more complicated to cope with, because the whole thing was about reducing the communes to obedience, and the communes, however, answered Frederick, who had injuncted them to reunite to Cremona in Easter 1226 by reconstituting the Lombard League. This was actually an imperial diet that had to be held there. Also, the German vassals had to present themselves in place instead. The Lombard League blockaded essentially the Alpine passes, made the diet fail fundamentally, and there was nothing there that Frederick could do, because he hadn't levied an army to cope with the Lombard League that had been reconstituted in only at that point, on that occasion. So, as you know, as we will see also later, maybe not in this video because it stopped to 1229. Of course, Frederick fought quite on large scale and bitterly against the Lombard League. But already at this point, this alliance was extremely important in his relations with the papacy, with properly his imperial role, because it was effectively a major force that stood essentially between Germany and Sicily, that was allied with the Pope, importantly enough, and so constituted, as also the events of Cremona showed, this important strategical threat and kind of disconnection of this important area of the empire for the emperor to rule. And at that point, things could actually already degenerate, but it was Honorius III who prevented that for the moment a clash between Frederick and the Lombard League would actually occur. In 1227, at the death of Honorius III, Gregory IX rose to the papal throne. He was old but energetic. He gave immediately signs not to tolerate further Frederick's policy relatively to this ambiguity of what the agreements with the papacy had been, this attempt to essentially monopolize control all over this large area, and therefore making pressures on the same papacy. And in fact, two were the main reasons relative for the attrition, let's say, for the contracts between the emperor and the pope. So first of all, as we just said, Frederick had never fulfilled those obligements that he had assumed in order to separate the empire and the kingdom of Sicily, right? This was more than just a dynastic issue. It was literally about considering Sicily properly as part of, like, as a papal fief or not, right? You know that Sicily was not part technically of the Holy Roman Empire, but of course the Hohenstaufen had stressed this prerogative. Even Frederick's parents, in that sense, albeit they had never argued among each other, I mean, at least publicly in political affairs, but they were still proponents of two different views. Of course, Henry VI, through his marriage with Constance, had stressed that point. I mean, in some ways, where they had means to fictionalize this, even if without any kind of pre-existing rights, but still, for the emperor to say it was a big deal, that of course Sicily was becoming, through this marriage, like an imperial fief. Constance, when she was already married with Henry, but she kept saying, as the Siculo-Norman heiress, no, the kingdom of Sicily is really independent, it's just a papal fief, and as such, has to obey only the Pope, not the emperor. So it was really a matter of perspective, you would say, but nevertheless, there could be a lot of ideology, ideology played on these political issues, and so that could influence big changes in the process, and all concretize itself on the pressure that you could make in order to make the side that supported your view shift from, enlarge and become more powerful. Secondly, Frederick had promised the Pope multiple occasions, several things, including the fact that including a liberty, right, of the clergy in his own dominions that in practice was very far from granting. For example, Frederick wouldn't hesitate to systematically interfere in the episcopal elections, trying to favor people that were faithful to him and obstacling appointments of his own adversaries. In the Kingdom of Sicily, notoriously, the church properties were very consistent. So, interfering in the episcopal election was really a way to exercise a great amount of factual power in the country. And of course, the papacy said, first of all, you're my vassal, you should obey temporally. Secondly, these are churches' property, so they technically don't even pertain to any temporal power that you can, that you can therefore use to interfere in. So it was a delicate situation. And finally, there was this had been, by the way, I mean, not just Frederick's problem, it's a problem of the whole issue of the struggle for investitures, and especially in Sicily since the early Norman times. But let's say this was much more, was revived, importantly, at this point. Then there was the matter of the Crusade, right? At the time, between 1217 and 1221, another crusading expedition had been carried out that, however, had not reached the Holy Land because it had essentially committed itself in the siege of the Egyptian port of Damietta. So the heads of the Crusades, among which the papal legate, the Cardinal Pelagius, had convinced themselves that the Egyptian Sultan attacked in that port that, together with Alexandria, was his principal source of wealth, right? Because of the enormous, profits gained there, passing through the, to the same port, through the concession to the Italian merchants, to all the goods that passed from the Red Sea to across Egypt and then in Mediterranean, would have reacted by dealing with them, essentially negotiating and granting Jerusalem in exchange for peace and security of trade. And indeed, Egypt, yes, historically as a region is mostly, of course, rich because of its important fertile valley and agricultural area, but indeed, in order to maintain the political control on the area, that as in medieval times, it was always a rather complicated thing to do, right? All that wealth coming from the main Egyptian ports was necessary for the stability, and still it was also a broader indicator of factual strength, right? As an Egyptian sultan that could not maintain the control of those cities was inherently a weaker one. You know that the Ayyubids at this point were had a broader ambition, right, all over, in fact, the Near East, not just Egypt and other areas, and they were also power to be reckoned with. So the only one that effectively had brought the Crusaders after the fall of Jerusalem to realize that rather than trying to recapture the city with a costly siege, it would have been much easier to pressure Egypt and to threaten and make it collapse in order to have a diplomatic settlement. And so Frederick was pushed at that point to resume the struggle exactly with a military expedition against Egypt. Now, Frederick didn't really have a real strategic interest from his standpoint to become enemy of the Egyptian Sultan. Those territories were so close to Sicily, and with whom, after all, he was actually in relations of diplomatic friendship, and had by the way not sent any help to the Crusaders, which was something that was objectively seen. Like, you are the Holy Roman Emperor, so independently from any power consideration, you should be the first one leading the crusade in the first place. And so not only you're not doing it yet, as you promised, among the other things, to the Pope, but you're not even sending help of any sort, and you're basically friend with the Saracens. So Gregory IX thought well to insist on this point, because it seemed kind of self-evident, and it was very difficult to change the basic line of Frederick's political choices, because, in fact, of these mechanisms that we have just listed. And speaking of the relation between empire and Sicily, it was at that point unthinkable, unrealistic to believe that Frederick could have just renounced to the two prestigious crowns, right? To even just one of the two. At the same point, as we've seen, Frederick was trying to reduce ecclesiastic power in his own lands in favor of more of a lay administration, of more centralized government. So it would have been easier to pressure Frederick because of his unfulfillment of the crusading promise. And in the widespread feeling of the time, the crusade was a must of each sovereign faithful to the church. And furthermore, it was said that Frederick had, in fact, promised, right, to Honorius III the organization of the enterprise. That, of course, he was not against in principle. It's just that the political contingencies wouldn't really bring him any a desire for realistic. So there were also many ways crusades could be launched. It was a matter also just being literally on the ground, seeing the reorganization of the Outremer states, and resuming. There were different fronts this crusade could be open. At least the most direct one didn't, however, seem to Frederick more advantageous. So at that point, the Pope pretended that Frederick would immediately leave for the Crusade, and since an expedition that was ready by autumn 1227 didn't, it actually even left the port, but was aborted because of an epidemic that spread among the troops, then that actually also the same Frederick fell sick for. The Pope excommunicated the sovereign, right, at that point, because he was really leaving, but literally it was this epidemic. He also felt sick, and he had to come back to Apulia, and it was was definitely a problem. This was taken by the Pope as an excuse to excommunicating the sovereign that seemed to be ever less sympathetic to any kind of papal policy, and was posing increasing pressure on his dominions to reduce the influence of. And as it is notorious, excommunication solved the subjects of a sovereign from any duty of fealty towards him. So any political enemy of Frederick in Germany, in Italy, or in Sicily would have at this point the right to rise, actually in arms even, for his own interests by proclaiming to do it in the name of the faith. And this brought Frederick to leave in 1228 for the Crusade still, because the expedition was not was just belated, right? And he actually went, even though he was excommunicated. So basically, he went to Crusade, and this caused problems, as we'll see, with papal excommunication. By the way, during his absence, the Pope had also invaded Sicily. It was a mess. So it's really as harsh you can imagine, and still the fact that Frederick had invested so much of his time and energies in the expedition reveals that he had some interesting plans about the Crusade theater after all. And however, he had taken very precise countermeasures. First of all, he had known how to gain the dynastic interests in the Holy Land by marrying the heiress of the crown of Jerusalem. There was Isabelle-Jolande de Brienne, and thus presenting himself in Palestine as the legitimate pretendant to the crown of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, and as such, contemplating to put an order between the vassals and the communes of the coastal cities, by which the kingdom was basically just constituted, because at least had lost the Saint Jerusalem. And of course, Frederick's presence in the Holy Land was important for a number of reasons. Of course, for this international universal task the emperor had as a figure that would have to join the Crusade, and so that's something that all his imperial ancestors had done before him, or at least attempted. So Frederick was, think about it, because his father basically had died just before the Crusade could leave. Eventually the Germans left after Henry's death, but the expedition was a disaster. Frederick I, had, as died just even before in Anatolia, before reaching the Holy Land. So there was something even in this kind of strikingly sinister misfortunes that struck the Hohenstaufen dynasty that Frederick had to reverse in a certain sense. But the point was also deeper than that. It was, in fact, realizing how potentially meaningful the Ottoman states could be and what the imperial presence there could mean. Because, you see, these land stripes now that were, after the loss of Jerusalem, had naturally lost much of their strategic values, were still garrisoned by, for example, the monastic-military orders that were a forces that had a sense, mostly in fact in a universal perspective, right? This was a moment in which gradually And not just, see, if the Outremer states fell to Saracen pressure, these orders would have not really had much of a meaning, right? At least in considering that the majority of, especially of the French, the English, I mean, this presence that had been the strongest in the Near East was mostly concentrated just for it. I mean, the Spanish had their own orders. Some, of these, of course, the Templars of the Hospitallers were fighting there as well. Frederick was connected to the Teutonic order that he also, boosted importantly with the spread of not just giving permission to launch their expeditions against the Prussians in the Baltic, but also expanding their supporting with imperial policy. For example, the ANSA, the Baltic trade, to support their mission. And it was successful, by the way, at least in that case. But these orders saw naturally in the figure of a universal ruler, not just in a single monarch that actually had an interest in seizing all these orders' possessions in land, especially as they would grow less combative, let's say, less warlike, due to the loss of the Holy Land, as it would happen. Think about the Templars in France, right? Were literally knocked out and exterminated eventually. So that was something that the orders were starting to see. So Frederick seemed as their greater hope, but still there was this problem now. Frederick was excommunicated. So this caused a lot of issues that made Frederick's presence really, really difficult there. But the main goal was still getting Jerusalem. And Frederick had this important understanding. He caught the chance to actually strengthen his friendship with the Sultan of Egypt rather than going at war with him. There is a beautiful correspondence between the two in which, Frederick was, he knew Islamic culture. He knew, the mindset. He knew the international situation generally, as he was a learned, informed, cultured individual. And he wrote to the Sultan with an attitude that was very, like from, like man to man, face to face, even friend to friend properly, like as they had already been in diplomatic relations, saying, look, here we know what the situation is. I am the Holy Roman Emperor. I'm the champion of my faith. I have to respond to this in my land. So if I don't do it, things will happen badly in my land. So I'm sorry, but I have to attack you. I have to wage a crusade. And so to you, this is going to be bad anyway. And I know that you don't want to hand Jerusalem, but I still have to. So there is a way in which we can settle the matter that the both of us will essentially obtain the least, let's say, damage from. And so this is better than a full-scale war. And so let's come to an agreement, right? And this agreement was accepted by the Sultan Al-Malik Al-Kamil, who in fact negotiated with Frederick a treaty on the base of which Jerusalem was fundamentally handed over the Christians, the Crusade, in this case, the Holy Roman Emperor properly. It was a 10 years long agreement. It sounded more like a truce objectively than anything, because at the end of the day, Jerusalem had its walls dismantled to render impossible its defense if the Christians had wanted to maintain it eventually. And with the exclusion of the area, by the way, of Umar's mosque, that was at the time deemed by the Christians as the Temple of Solomon, but was factually a Muslim holy place. And so Frederick negotiated these conditions, and it was in fact in Jerusalem that, albeit being excommunicated, he entered, right, wearing solemnly the crown of that kingdom in 1229. There were issues with the same monastic-military orders, because they said it was very difficult to have Frederick recognized in that situation, but he had staged this crowning ceremony, a solemn official one, and so he managed, in spite of all these difficulties, to seize Jerusalem and to wear his crown. So the local clergy was not happy because of this. Almost all the vassals were not happy because of this. Frederick eventually spent some months in the Holy Land trying, and also, by the way, without succeeding, to put order in this, at that point, tragic situation which the kingdom dwelt. And so, as you can imagine, it was a difficult. Also, his retreat from the land was not very glorious, but he at least achieved this result of getting back to Jerusalem. The Pope was very far from being pleased by this result, because effectively, Jerusalem was Christian again. But a treaty, say, of friendship instead than a Manu-Military conquest was not in the papal plans. And furthermore, Frederick had dared to wear the crown in the Holy City, right? A royal crown, despite he was not communicated yet again. So, truthfully, besides these reasons, there was especially the worry for the fact that the emperor had actually managed to transform in a new success an enterprise that had as an aim in the intentions of the Pope to put him in difficulty at the same time. Because again, after this result, the struggle between Frederick and the Church became kind of irreversible, and the situation escalated dramatically with also the war in the same papal invasion of Sicily, eventually the war with the Lombard League. So we will talk about this actually another time, but it's relevant to stress the enormous difficulty that Frederick was facing in this time, right? And so what could be properly gained from an hopelessly difficult situation, what basically no other crusading expedition at that point had managed to achieve, and that he had at least, right, with reason, with negotiation, with common sense, managed to let the same Sultan of Egypt granting him Jerusalem formally, albeit he knew that he would have not been able to maintain it, right? It was just a compromise, like 10 years. In that time, 10 years, you could just feel extremely lucky if you had been alive by then, and Frederick actually would be alive beyond that. But it's still those situations, those risks that you have to take if you want to succeed in the first place, because the equivalent would have been an excommunication, a new war, maybe a crusade waged against Sicily itself. And so, as later events would prove, that risk was actually quite concrete. Alright, for now, however, we stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time.